In my most recent video before this one, we were talking about binge eating, why it's so hard to stop, 10 key reasons why that is, and right at the end we touched on cravings. Now cravings obviously make binge eating really hard to stop, and I wanted to make a whole video talking about the causes of cravings, where they come from, because they can feel like this just elusive random thing that happens to us that we're almost at the mercy of. Know that some of them might be immediately obvious to you. You might say, oh yeah, that's me. Some of them you may not be aware of. That was certainly true for me. It's certainly true of many of my clients. The first one, which is probably the most common one, is I let myself get too hungry, or I've been ignoring appetite cues. High hunger can often just show up as cravings, typically for high sugar and high fat foods, really energy dense, calorie dense foods. If we try to minimize and diffuse cravings, then we're also not honoring our hunger. Then this is, firstly, it's not appropriate, and secondly, it's almost an exercise in futility. We must make sure that we're eating regularly, honoring our hunger, so that our excess hunger isn't showing up as cravings. Second one, which is really typical, is I've been too strict with my diet. I've been too strict with food rules. Now, while we're talking about minimizing cravings, that's very much in the context of having peace with all foods and permission to eat all foods. For the vast majority of us, as soon as we have foods that we aren't allowed to eat, foods that are off limits, it focuses our attention on the thing that we are trying to avoid. And if that's the case, it might be more helpful to bring those foods in and have them at times when you don't crave them. Now, the very common reason for cravings is PMS or PMT. This is certainly true for me. This is when I have my highest amount of cravings. There's an element of this which is just normal to be expected. To have higher hunger and higher cravings is pretty typical and pretty normal, and no cause for concern around the PMS time. But this can be mild for some people and it can be moderate to severe for others. I was getting intense cravings for particularly cereal and chocolate for a whole week on the lead up to my period, and that to me was something that was worth exploring and worth addressing. I'd like to make a whole video on PMS, cravings and hunger in general. If you guys would find that helpful, then give this video a thumbs up so I know. Alcohol is another one. Either whilst drinking alcohol or on the day after can absolutely raise cravings. There is some advice in when healing our relationship with food or while we're in recovery to perhaps minimize how much alcohol that we're drinking, because it can interfere with our cravings and our relationship with food and hunger and appetite levels, which of course is entirely personal choice, but it's an important thing to be aware of because it does factor in. Physiologically speaking, we can get cravings when our blood sugar is dropping a little bit too low, which can happen if we've skipped a meal or haven't quite eaten enough, if we're on the go, or if we've been exercising and we haven't been fueling ourselves adequately. Once we go down the path of intuitive eating or normal eating, we start to get in tune with our body. You might notice that low blood sugar has a specific feeling. It has specific body sensations. Smelling food or seeing food in some of us can induce quite intense cravings. This is certainly magnified if we are in a place of deprivation, i.e. we can't eat certain foods or we've let ourselves get too hungry. And for most people, there's an element of that's quite normal if you see or smell food to be interested in it, or, you know, have a look to see what it is. But for some of us, this can induce really intense cravings. So notice when you have a craving, is it because you smelt or saw food? Because that's an important thing to know. Again, we won't talk about then how to deal with that in this video, but just becoming aware of it for now. Low mood can definitely induce cravings. If our serotonin, which is, to simplify it, is sort of a happy neurotransmitter, this can induce cravings absolutely, because what raises serotonin is many things, but in that is carbohydrates. So if our serotonin is low, our mood is low, then this can show up as craving for high carbohydrate foods. Impulsivity can induce cravings. What I mean by that is cravings might be an automatic response. This kind of ties into smelling food or seeing food or having food around in our environment. We may have developed an automatic response to that to then go and eat the food that's almost running on autopilot. Clients that have this, it typically shows up as, I ate the food and I didn't even realize that that's what I was doing. It just happened so automatically. Another big one is tiredness or needing rest. Fatigue definitely can induce cravings. If you get less than 7.5 hours of sleep or 7 hours of sleep, and you feel like that's sufficient for you, but you also get a lot of cravings, then it's something to explore. Perhaps you aren't getting sufficient sleep. Maybe, maybe not, but it's something to explore, even if you feel like it's an adequate amount. Lack of sleep, lack of rest can induce cravings for sugar, and it can also just make us hungrier in general. Stress absolutely can induce cravings. For some people, stress makes us less hungry, and for others, stress can make us more hungry, and sometimes it depends on the intensity of the stress itself. Some types of stress, for me personally, let's say heartbreak, my appetite just plummets. I'm not hungry at all. But stress, if I'm, say, studying for an exam, will induce more cravings. And this is partly because stress influences our blood sugar. There's a relationship there between our stress hormones and our blood sugar levels. And it's also because we can build up the association of food or particular types of food comforting us or calming us down in times of stress. There are some meanings or associations with food that can come out of our childhood that can induce cravings for some of us. One of those is entitlement beliefs around food. That's cravings and a desire to eat being induced by thoughts of, well, I should be able to eat this, or everyone else is eating this, why can't I? And another one is deprivation beliefs about food. Let's say someone brings to the office some cake, and there's only one cake and there's a lot of people in the office, and you weren't in the mood for cake, you weren't even thinking about cake, and you watch people come over and take a slice, and like the slices are going down and the cake is getting smaller and smaller, and that induces a craving in you because the food is about to go. I always recommend for anyone that wants to heal their relationship with food or understand their relationship with food better to have a look at what the role that food played in our childhood. Was there a sense in childhood that you were deprived of certain foods or food in general? If so, this may now be playing out in adult life, even though as an adult we have our own money and we have our own freedom to buy and eat whatever food we like. This sense of deprivation around food or entitlement around food can still persist because it's part of our automatic wiring. Feeling depleted of purpose can induce cravings. I experienced this not too long ago, quite recently. There was almost a sense there of using food as a pick-me-up, or just a way to kind of do something to have a bit of fun because other aspects of my life were lacking. And I wasn't consciously aware of this until I reflected on it, which is why I'm bringing these to you today, just to reflect on, because sometimes we can be consciously unaware that this is playing into our cravings. On the topic of purpose, go and watch the video on needs, talking about the different needs that we have and how food or food restraint can be used to meet some of those needs if they're not being fulfilled elsewhere. And having a sense of purpose is one of those, but the others also apply. Feeling diminished can induce cravings. Absolutely. This is almost like a yearning for comfort that we're looking for through food. Again, if this is happening, we may not be consciously aware of it. It might just feel like we're hungry or we're having extra cravings. One that I experienced recently, again, not consciously at first, only when I reflected on it. Feeling angry or frustrated for some of us can induce more cravings. Sometimes consciously, but sometimes unconsciously. I didn't realize recently that I was suppressing anger because anger had been taught to me in my childhood to be a useless emotion. So I haven't ever really in my life experienced a lot of anger. And through the trying to block that emotion, it just showed up as being hungrier and having more cravings. I was unaware of that anger at all until I delved into it, which brings me on to the next point, which is some of us have emotions that to us aren't acceptable, or we perceive to be really negative, and we find it hard to validate to ourselves. It could be sadness, it could be anger, it could be rejection, abandonment, any of these. If we have emotions that to us are unacceptable, we may, not always, but we may try to block these or distract from these feelings through eating. And these feelings may just show up as increased hunger or increased cravings, and we might be consciously completely unaware of the emotion itself. So I would highly encourage all of us, if we have a lot of cravings or we're just trying to learn more about our relationship with food in general, is to go through the list of feelings and have a look. Are there ones that you never experience? that you may be blocking out? Are there ones that are not acceptable to you to feel? If so, explore that and how it might be related to cravings. It may or may not be, but it's definitely worth exploring. You'd be surprised how common this is. Having difficulty coping and not having appropriate coping strategies can show up as cravings if food has become the learned response from our mind of coping with situations, stress, emotions, frustration, whatever the case may be. And again, first, it's then important to become emotionally aware and then to look at how are we coping? Do we have a good sense of self-efficacy? Do we have good problem-solving skills? Do we know how to engage in self-care? Do we feel very confident and self-assured in our ability to navigate through life and our emotional world? Because if we don't, it can show up as a learned response to use food in that way to do that. Again, maybe consciously, but often unconsciously. Cravings can show up for some of us if there's something that we need to vocalize, we need to assert ourselves in some way, or there's something that we need to communicate to someone or others, and we find it difficult to. And again, food in this instant might be the learned response to distract from the discomfort of not being able to assert ourselves or communicate. It sounds very abstract, but it definitely does happen. I've made a whole video on assertiveness and communication and how it relates to how we think about food and cravings. So if that seems abstract to you and you feel like that may be something that applies to you, I highly recommend that you go and watch that video. Along the same line of discussing needs and how that relates to cravings, ask yourself, if you get frequent and intense cravings, is there something else that I'm really wanting that's showing up as a want for food? And again, I know it sounds abstract, but it does happen. It might be I want physical closeness. It might be I want better friendships, deeper friendships. I might want to have more fun. I might want to have more stimulation. I'm not being intellectually or creatively stimulated. And again, the list of needs that we discussed in that other video might help point you in the right direction for personal exploration on that. And the last one to discuss today, and there are probably others, these are the ones that just came to my mind as I was writing them down. If you can think of any others, please do share them in the comments below. Have I recently eaten a trigger food? And trigger foods for us individually can be very, very different. A trigger food for you might be different to a trigger food for me. For instance, I have noticed, and again, going down the path of intuitive eating, it's a continually evolving process, continually learning from. But I've recently come to notice that bananas, if I just eat a banana, about half an hour later, I'm craving sugar. This can be a difficult thing to navigate if we haven't got to the point where we are honoring hunger and we have made peace with food and we're able to be reflecting curiously and non-judgmentally. If we've got to that point in our relationship with food, then this makes building our awareness on what our trigger foods are and how different foods influence us and impact us, that can then start to become more apparent. So with all of that being said, now, when you get cravings, you can take a look through this and ask yourself if one of these things may be applying to you right there in that moment. There's a lot more information to be gained doing it in the moment of having a craving, but you can also do it afterwards and reflect backwards and say, I wonder what else was going on, because you'll notice that there starts to be some recurring themes. And once you know where your cravings are coming from and what the root of them are, then we can start to work on the root itself to ultimately minimize how often you're getting cravings, which we'll discuss in the next video on this topic. And we'll also discuss how then we can go about diffusing cravings from a calm place, a more peaceful place, rather than just trying to ignore cravings using, white knuckle willpower. But the mentality that we go into that with, I think, is incredibly important. That's all from me today, and I'll make a kind of part 2 to this video soon. Take care of yourselves, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.